DeAndre Hopkins signed with the Tennessee Titans on Sunday. We talk about how that actually weakens other AFC contenders at the hands of the Baltimore Ravens. All that and more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Here, I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire. We're here as always on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here with us, making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day, 5 days per week, free and available, all podcasting platforms, including over in video form on YouTube. So you can subscribe for free, both in video form and in audio form. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. We're a 5-day-a-week Ravens podcast here on Locked On Ravens, when your Ravens news, analysis, updates. We have you covered, as I mentioned, both in video form and in audio form, so you can tell a friend, tell a family member. If you're an everydayer, thank you so much for being here every single day. If this is your first time listening or watching, welcome in. Hopefully you enjoy the content here, and if you're somewhere in the middle, of course, thank you for your support. We're going to talk about a lot today. Training camp it's coming up. We've been waiting so long. We're in the lower period of the offseason, but that is kind of, we're ushering out that era and bringing in some really juicy training camp and obviously preseason and regular season games, hopefully playoff and Super Bowl games as well. Let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins here. And I know you're probably saying, Kevin, you've talked about DeAndre Hopkins for forever, for so long. Just stop it. I know my dad's probably saying that right now. Well, look, we now know to where DeAndre Hopkins is signing. The Tennessee Titans signed their 2-year, $26 million deal. And that's something that, is going to help the Titans out, but it actually weakens other AFC contenders at the hands of the Ravens. So we'll talk about that whole story and how the Ravens actually had a role to play in what happened with DeAndre Hopkins on Sunday. Then in the second part of the show, we're still going to talk about DeAndre Hopkins, but just talk about if the Ravens needed him or not because of all the new additions to Baltimore's wide receiver group. Obviously, the passing offense, I think, is going to be a lot better, and you're going to have more volume there. But did they actually need DeAndre Hopkins in that offense? Then finally, we'll talk a bit about how the Ravens are built. Kind of goes hand in hand with the second segment a little bit, but obviously we'll talk defense in that segment too. So let's get into how the Ravens actually, this, I don't know if it was a devious plan or not, but hey, look, it happened. They actually had a role to play in other AFC contenders missing out on DeAndre Hopkins. Obviously, the Ravens signed Odell Beckham Jr. to that 1-year deal. I remember when DeAndre Hopkins, was first put on the market. And the Ravens already signed Odell Beckham, right? And everybody was talking about, the Ravens just signed Odell to that big money contract. Well, now they've shown their willingness to sign a receiver to a big money contract. Go out there and get DeAndre Hopkins. That deal Odell Beckham signed was 1 year, $15 million guaranteed. That goes up to $18 million in incentives. But that whole thing, it also included void years and whatnot. But when that happened, I remember when Odell first, some of the first reports about Odell came out, it was he wanted a 1-year deal up to $20 million or right around $20 million for that one season. And I'm like, there's no way he's going to get that. And then the Ravens gave him what they gave him. And I think, again, that was a necessary overpay to get Odell. Not that it was just because I think it's a necessary overpay does not mean I think it's a bad deal. I talked about that when Odell was first signed. But because of that, back in May, if you remember, like late May, early June, there were a couple of notes. Albert Breer of NFL Network actually reported that the Chiefs and the Bills were the only teams that have substance trade talks with Arizona in terms of DeAndre Hopkins before he ended up being released. And it was the contract. The contract was the issue in terms of, DeAndre Hopkins. There was a huge situation where, if DeAndre Hopkins would have been traded to one of these teams like Kansas City or Buffalo, they didn't have cap space. Those teams barely had any or didn't have any cap space at all. So Kansas City made progress on, potentially a new deal with DeAndre Hopkins, but Odell signing that deal, a $15 million base salary, Albert Breer said he reported it more or less blew that progress up that Kansas City had made on that. And so, obviously if, DeAndre Hopkins is in Tennessee now. It doesn't matter at this point. But back in May, I reported that, if his price drops, then maybe incentive-heavy deals could work. Then maybe. And I know there were a lot of people who said, oh, well, now DeAndre Hopkins is signed with Baltimore because, they did that. Well, regardless, DeAndre Hopkins, it's a win for the Ravens. Obviously, I would have loved DeAndre Hopkins in Baltimore. We talked about that on this show when we were still having those conversations. I would have loved it. But the fact that he did not go to Kansas City, did not go to Buffalo even, the fact that the Ravens essentially reportedly had a hand in blowing up that trade to put DeAndre Hopkins in Kansas City with Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce on the defending champs already is a huge win for the Ravens. It weakens other AFC contenders. And while the Ravens didn't get him and didn't upgrade their roster by getting him, the fact that, look, essentially, if that deal went through, Kansas City would have strengthened their roster. The fact that happened means the Ravens effectively weakened Kansas City while nothing, like a deal did not end up getting completed. So there was nothing to, I guess, necessarily weaken in the first place, if you want to take it from that perspective. Baltimore doing that is a huge win for them. And him landing in Tennessee, to me, I think, it changes the outlook on Tennessee a little bit. I think they're more of a contender than they were. Ryan Tannehill, while not, a top 10 quarterback in the league, is, I guess, serviceable. Derrick Henry is one of the best running backs in this league still. Is now DeAndre Hopkins and Treylon Burks. They have some solid defensive pieces. I don't think they're necessarily a threat to the Ravens at this point, but it does change their outlook, but not enough to where it would have. DeAndre Hopkins is not going to make the impact on Tennessee that he would have made on Kansas City or Buffalo, or one of those other AFC contenders, where Tennessee before DeAndre Hopkins was not really listed. I mentioned that the AFC had like 12 and a half playoff teams, essentially. Tennessee was not in that conversation for me for the most part. I didn't really have them in there. Now I would say the AFC has 13 and a half contenders this year, playoff teams this year, with the Raiders being half a team. And then, look, I don't really think the Texans and the Colts are going to make any noise this year. So that to me is not one. So the Colts, the Texans, and half of the Raiders are not playoff teams in the AFC. Everybody else, I think, can make the playoffs or has a shot to make the playoffs this year. And depending on what happens with Jimmy Garoppolo, maybe there are 14 worthy AFC playoff contenders this season. So I think while it does make the AFC conference stronger as a whole, there's a lot of talent in the AFC, a lot of good teams, good coaches, good players, etc. It's a win for the Ravens that essentially signing Odell added a really good wide receiver to their offense, and also effectively reportedly stopped Kansas City from adding an all-pro. I still think DeAndre Hopkins is a top 10 wide receiver. I've said that multiple times. He's someone who I think fits in with Tennessee, but he would have been great with Patrick Mahomes. He would have been great with Josh Allen. And those are the two contenders where you think, well, look, Kansas City has lost a couple guys, and Buffalo is kind of in a weird state right now. Adding DeAndre Hopkins would have made those two teams so much harder to beat. Not that the Ravens couldn't have if DeAndre Hopkins signed there, but the fact that, again, essentially the Ravens weakened other AFC contenders, and they probably didn't even know what was going on, right? There could have been a contract situation with DeAndre Hopkins where, it almost reminds me a little bit, if everything kind of lines up. I know it's not the exact same situation, but it almost reminds me a little bit of what happened with Zadarius Smith in Baltimore a couple of years ago, right? Where, and again, it's not a great memory to bring up, but I just want to compare the situations where essentially the Ravens, reportedly, again, we don't really know exactly what went down, but based off the information out there from, reporters and whatnot, I know Zadarius Smith had his own side of the story, but I don't know how many people believe that side of the story. But reportedly, Darius Smith had agreed to the contract with the Ravens, but then he saw what Von Miller got after he agreed. He saw what Chandler Jones got after he agreed, and those two got huge money deals. And at the time, we were talking on Locked On Ravens about how, that's a Darius Smith deal for the Ravens. It's such a steal for his production. He's coming back home to Baltimore. And then Zadarius Smith apparently backed out and then re-agreed and then backed out again because, again, he wanted to capitalize on the market a little bit more considering what Von Miller and Chandler Jones got. So, maybe DeAndre Hopkins saw what Odell got, and he was maybe working on a revised contract with Kansas City because of the cap situation Kansas City was, and I think still isn't at this point. But then he saw what Odell got, and he said, hold on a second. It's clear DeAndre Hopkins, he did not take a pay cut to go chase a ring. He wanted the money, then that is his prerogative. He can do what he wants there. NFL players, they value what they value. And NFL players value things differently. Some NFL players value rings and championships. Others value stats. Others value money. In this case, it's clear DeAndre Hopkins valued money in this situation. I'm not saying it's a terrible fit for him either. I mean, there are targets to go around in Tennessee, but him signing in Kansas City or Buffalo for a lot less money would have increased his chances to win a ring. So I think Baltimore, again, it's a win on like 5 different levels for them that this move happened. For the fact that they got Odell in the whole thing, that deal with Odell blew up the Kansas City deal. Now he's in Tennessee, where I don't think it hurts them as much as him going to one of those other top end AFC contenders. So credit to Eric DeCosta, credit to the Ravens. Good on them for doing that, even if it wasn't totally the plan they envisioned when they signed Odell. But coming up in the second part of the show, also talk DeAndre Hopkins, talking about if the Ravens actually even needed him in the first place here after all the moves they've made. So be sure to stay tuned. Plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. And these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. The job market is all over the place right now. And I know with that, you want to be 100% certain you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. And LinkedIn's helped me a ton throughout my life, looking for jobs, finding jobs, getting interviews. It's a tool that I've used for so many things. It's really easy to create a free job post over on LinkedIn Jobs. You have to add your job in the profile hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. And they also have really simple tools you can use that are really useful, like screening questions that make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience. So you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and who you'd like to hire. And it's really important to start the year strong. And there are a lot of ways you can do that, but the right team member, especially for your small business, can help you do that. It's why small business is right. LinkedIn Jobs #1 delivering quality hires for city competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to fast. About your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. We're back here, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still hanging out with you on this Monday as we again creep closer and closer to training camp. The excitement's been building for a while, right? I mean, I'm excited for this Ravens team this season. I mean, it feels like everybody is really excited. Feels like the vibes are there for this team. But of course, we talked about in the first segment, DeAndre Hopkins will not be a part of those vibes, signing with Tennessee. 2 years, $26 million, I think up to around $32 million in guarantees, or maybe it's incentives with that, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously a deal Baltimore could not have given out unless there were major restructures. Maybe they had to get rid of a few guys. But in my opinion, it's something I've talked about. DeAndre Hopkins, the Ravens didn't really need him in the first place. I mean, well, in the first place, yes, they did need him. But then after they signed everyone during the offseason and, drafting Zay Flowers and whatnot, the Ravens didn't really need him. It's something we talked about. We've had plenty of DeAndre Hopkins conversations. For those who are everydayers, exactly what I'm talking about. But in those conversations, I had said, look, at this point, we've talked for so long about signing wide receivers for so many years here on Locked On Ravens, the Ravens faithful, the fan base, people who cover the team. Wide receiver has been a position of weakness. The Ravens haven't gone out there and gotten a number one receiver, obviously for Lamar Jackson, but it's been rare, few and far in between, the Derek Masons, the Anquan Boltons, the Steve Smiths. But then the Ravens sign Odell, they draft Zay Flowers, they sign Nelson Aguilar, they still have Rashad Bateman and Devin Duvernay. For a team that needed a wide receiver one for so long, or at least something like a wide receiver one, someone like a wide receiver one for so long, we're talking about wide receivers here in Baltimore is a luxury as opposed to a need, which is just such a weird feeling. I mean, those who have listened, literally, if you've been with me from the beginning on Locked On Ravens, we talked about Julio Jones for like 3 straight years, Antonio Brown, the Corey Davis days. There are so many receivers we talked about where it's why aren't you going out there and getting that guy? We've even talked about DeAndre Hopkins before, in that 2019, back when he was traded from Houston to Arizona and Baltimore just missed out on him. Talked A.J. Brown, all these different players. But the Ravens did not need DeAndre Hopkins. Now, look, would he have been great as a luxury player in this offense? Yeah, I mean, of course, DeAndre Hopkins, Odell Beckham Jr., Rashad Bateman, and Zay Flowers, that to me is the best, 4 wide receiver group in the NFL, plus the depth with Nelson Aguilar and Devin Duvernay on top of that. But I think the argument for a lot of people was the fact that, hey, look, that getting DeAndre Hopkins a top 10 wide receiver would be awesome. You add more offense, more firepower. But what about the defensive needs? Like maybe another edge guy. You bring back Justin Houston, maybe another corner. You bring in, you bring back Marcus Peters, which doesn't seem like it's happening anymore, but maybe a guy like that, or Bryce Callahan or Chris Harris Jr. to play in the slot. So some people are saying, why spend on a luxury guy when you have actual needs on the defensive end, luxury guy on the offensive side of the ball versus, actual needs on the defensive side of the ball. And look, my opinion is that, if you spend on the offensive side of the ball, you add an offensive weapon, you actually help out the defense because the offense is scoring more. That keeps the defense off the field, gives your defense a lead. But I understood that whole thing. But at this point, with what the Ravens have at wide receiver, Odell, Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, that's a really good trio. Plus, I know the other conversation when it came to, well, should the Ravens sign DeAndre Hopkins even after adding Odell, Zay, and Nelson Aguilar was, look, there's only one football. We know that the Ravens passing offense, will be more bountiful this year. I think that we will definitely see a lot more passes thrown by Lamar Jackson, which is very exciting. But there is only one ball. And with that, are you taking away snaps from Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, essentially your young guys, and stunting growth there because you want these guys to grow within their roles? How would Bateman react to that? How would Zay Flowers react to that? And look, if you have the opportunity to bring in a good player to make your football team better, you do it, right? That's just what it is. With DeAndre Hopkins, I'm sure Baltimore probably at least, talked about it, whether internally or not. But, Eric DeCosta probably at least thought about, what would adding DeAndre Hopkins do to our football team? And we heard all the reports and the rumors about maybe Hopkins landing with the Ravens, seemed like it could have happened, right? It definitely seemed like on draft night, it was going to be a trade for DeAndre Hopkins and Lamar's extension. And, whether it was, for their first round pick at 22, which was Zay Flowers or something else, it seemed like DeAndre Hopkins was going to come to the Ravens. And at that point, it made more sense because Zay Flowers was not drafted by the team yet. And so you could say, oh, hey, look, Odell, Rashad Bateman, DeAndre Hopkins, that's one heck of a wide receiver trio. And it would have been incredible there. But now, you're talking about Hopkins getting cut after the Ravens drafted Zay Flowers. And at that point, it was a luxury. And so, sure, the Ravens missed out on a wide receiver who I think is still a top 10 guy and still very, very good. But for now, I think the Ravens are still in a very good spot with who they have added. Plus, you have Mark Andrews in the running game in what hopefully will be a very successful season for Lamar Jackson coming up here. But coming up in our final part of the show, we'll be talking about how the Ravens are built right now, getting a little bit more into what the passing offense is, but how much of a factor the run game is going to be, and especially with how they're built on the defensive side of the ball as well. So be sure to stay tuned. Plenty to talk about on Locked On Ravens. We're back here rounding out Locked On Ravens, our final part of the show. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Monday. Thank you so much again for tuning in with us on Locked On Ravens, making us your first listen every day. I'm really, overwhelmed by the support every single day from everybody listening, both in audio form and the video. From the comments I get, the positive ones, it's incredible. And all the people who've shown me support over the years, I really do appreciate that. You can subscribe for free, both in video form and in audio form. You can follow me on Twitter at KOstriker34. And of course, we'll be doing live shows after every preseason game, regular season game, hopefully playoff game and Super Bowl game. And also when any big move happens for the Ravens. But let's talk about how the Ravens are built right now, because there is a lot in terms of every year teams evolve. Every year teams look to get better. They change the playbook. And we know that offense. We know the Ravens offense is changing the playbook up as Todd Monken is now in and Greg Roman is out. That was, I think the biggest move of the offseason for the Ravens. I think it is an addition by subtraction with Greg Roman being out in the first place. But adding Todd Monken, and if you remember the offensive coordinator search, adding Todd Monken, it was, well, is it going to be Monken, maybe Dave Canales? Was Eric Bieniemy going to get a shot with the Ravens? I think Todd Monken fits what the Ravens are and fits how they're built and fits their timeline. Monken has the experience both as an NFL and a college offensive coordinator, has learned over the course of his coaching career to adapt to his personnel and is really good at it. Has had success running the football with teams that favor the run, has success passing the football with teams that favor the pass. And for Baltimore, I think there is some level of misconception, not across everybody who watches and fans, but there is some level of misconception that just because the Ravens are going to throw the ball more means the run game is going to become non-existent or it's going to be put on the back burner. I don't think that's the case. As I remind people, and I try to, John Harbaugh said that, the Ravens are still going to utilize some of the stuff that Greg Roman was able to install and put in both in the run game and in the pass game. So I don't think fans are completely free of Greg Roman. They are because he's not there, but some of that stuff will still be there. And again, I always give people credit where they're due here. And Greg Roman, I give credit for establishing one of the best run offenses, one in NFL history in 2019, but a run offense that had sustained success over his tenure there. Now, look, we can talk about all the negatives, of course. The play calling was not there for him, game awareness, play clock issues. I could go on and on about the negatives and why he needed to go probably last year, but it happened this offseason. But now Monken can bring in his expertise, his uniqueness to this offense and build it around the Ravens. How the Ravens built offensively, you build around Lamar Jackson, you build one with the run game, you don't take that out, but then you build with the ability to go 4 wide, and you can put tight ends in the slot. You can still go heavy with the tight ends and run play action off of that. You can run everybody deep. You do deep crossers. You run guys to the outside of the field. You put guys in between the numbers. You sit guys down in the middle of the field. That's how you need to be able to build this offense. And I think Todd Monken is already doing that and has done a good job of that based off everything we've seen and heard. But the best part of it to me is the fact that there are so many weapons for the Ravens and how Eric DeCosta built this offense, the undefendable offense. Eric DeCosta loves the speed aspect of things. And the Ravens don't necessarily have a Marquise Brown burner type. I mean, Devin Duvernay's fast, Nelson Aguilar's fast, Rashad Bateman has some deceptive speed to him, so does Zay Flowers. But at this point, I think that, it's almost to pick your poison like 5 different ways for these opposing defenses because of the way that Eric DeCosta has built this offense and the way Todd Monken and, of course, John Harbaugh will utilize the players here. But, of course, if you talk about, where's this Ravens offense built around? How's it built? It's built around Lamar. We know it's built around Lamar. Now, defensively, which is really interesting to me, I think there's a really cool aspect of what the Ravens can do this year. Mike Macdonald going into his second season. We know the Don Martindale defense, the guy who Mike Macdonald replaced. Aggressive blitzing style. You live by the blitz, you die by the blitz. Now, Mike Macdonald was still aggressive, not Don Martindale crazy aggressive with the blitzes and everything, where you won or lost games off of it with Martindale. That didn't happen with Mike Macdonald. But I think Mike Macdonald, we know that he loves sending pressure, and we know that he loves disguising blitzes. Now, maybe not as much as Don Martindale with those crazy disguised blitzes and everything, but sending guys off of the edge, delayed pressures. And now with the offseason the Ravens defense had, losing Calais Campbell, losing Chuck Clark, but you're able to move Kyle Hamilton into, I think, a bigger role in essentially Chuck Clark's role. You have young guys stepping up. This is going to be where the Ravens defense is built on young guys stepping up. They're banking on a lot of young players here, such as Justin Madubuike, Broderick Washington, Travis Jones, Odafe Owe, David Ajabo, Patrick Queen, Jalen Armour-Davis, Pepe Williams, Trayvon Mullen, Kyu Blue Kelly. They're banking on Kyle Hamilton also. You're banking on a lot of young players to take steps and take leaps. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have veterans. Obviously, Roquan Smith and Michael Pierce and Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Williams and those guys, they're veterans on that defense, and they know what's going on. But the Ravens defense, how they can utilize those guys is they're going to use their offensive line. It's not going to be their only role because they're actually good players, but you eat up space with those defensive linemen. You open up lanes for Patrick Queen and Roquan Smith to run through, whether it's on delayed blitzes or being able to stop the running back before he hits the pure second level. And then in the secondary, it's just play a physical brand of football. I've talked about it I feel like I've talked about it a lot this past month. But the Ravens have built their secondary to be super, super physical. The top 4 guys, Marlon Humphrey, Rock Ya-Sin, Marcus Williams, Kyle Hamilton, all have a decent level of physicality to them. Out of those 4, Marcus Williams is probably the least physical, but is still a pretty physical player. I mean, Rock Ya-Sin is suplexing guys on the field. Marlon Humphrey is one of the most physical corners in the NFL. And obviously, Kyle Hamilton showed it as a big nickel last year, showed it as a safety. His physicality is obviously there too. But this is going to be, it's a risk for the Ravens to trust this many young players. Some of them are going to break out. I mean, just with the sheer amount of guys they're trusting, some are going to have to, right? I mean, it would be a pure disaster if they didn't. And look, maybe I also forgot to mention Tyus Bowser. No disrespect to Tyus Bowser. I want to give a shout out to Tyus Bowser because he's somebody that I think gets lost in the sauce a little bit in terms of everybody thinking about the Ravens veterans, but Bowser has been a very steady presence for them. And obviously, unfortunately, suffered that torn Achilles in week 18 in 2021. But he's been so good, and his career arc has been great. But for a position like outside linebacker, where you're 3 deep, like that one, David Ajabo, Odafe Owe, Tyus Bowser, you have Tavius Robinson there, but I wouldn't use him a ton. I don't necessarily know, if the Ravens are going to bring in a Justin Houston or not. I personally would. But The Ravens defense is built as a fast defense, sideline to sideline, force opponents into third down and long, and get young quarterbacks rattled. That's what it is. It was the case with Don Martindale. It's the case with Mike McDonald. Young quarterbacks don't really have success against the Ravens defense, but when you go up against those stars, those veterans, it's just being able to condense possessions, right? That's how every defense is built. You condense possessions to make it so the opposing defense gets tired and your offense can go out there and just score. So I think the Ravens are built. It's a balanced team this year. I think it's a lot more balanced on both sides. I mean, there are some years, obviously, offensively for the Ravens over the past couple of years with Greg Roman has been, the run game's been really strong. The pass game's been really weak. For the past couple of years on defense, even dating back to Don Martindale, it's been, well, it's either the pass defense is great and the run defense is kind of meh, but usually it's the run defense has been incredible for them. The pass defense has been kind of middling. So I think the Ravens are a lot more balanced on both sides of the ball this year. And special teams is special teams. They're built to dominate there. So that's where they are there. But it's exciting. The Ravens have a really exciting season ahead of them. I'm really excited to see how it all pans out for them this season. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Again, be sure to tell a friend, tell a family member, whether they're a Ravens fan or maybe they're a fan of an opposing team. They want the opponent's perspective on things. I appreciate all the support here on Locked On Ravens. Coming up tomorrow, more Ravens content as we get closer and closer to training camp. So be sure to stay tuned. Plenty to talk about and more to come here on Locked On Ravens. See you right back here tomorrow.